Through the heavy summer air of Paris, the sound of bells trembled like iron hearts, beating in the distance, mingling with cries and the shuffle of hurried feet. From the high windows of the Louvre, Catherine de Medici was said to have stood, her gaze lowered upon streets where blood ran into the stones, where houses smoldered and the river carried the stain of death. The year was 1572, and the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had begun its dreadful course, leaving the city and the memory of France forever scarred. Welcome, dear listener. Across all places and all hours, I invite you to share where you are listening and when you first discovered these stories, so that together we weave a net of memory across the world. If you find meaning in these whispered passages, I ask you to subscribe, to keep alive the thread of time as it flows between us. Let us begin. The tale of Catherine de Medici does not open in France, nor even in the glitter of a royal court, but rather in Florence, city of towers and shadows, on the 23rd day of April in the year 1519. She was born Caterina Maria Romola di Lorenzo de' Medici, daughter of Lorenzo II, Duke of Urbino, and Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, a French noblewoman. Her life began in grandeur, for the Medici were a house of bankers and patrons whose name reached across Europe, yet within days sorrow cast its veil. Her mother died from fever soon after giving birth, and her father followed into death scarcely a week later. The infant Catherine was left an orphan, alone, though surrounded by the wealth and name of her family. One wonders if the silence of loss marked her spirit before words themselves had formed upon her lips. The child was placed under the guardianship of her grandmother, Alfonsina Orsini, who watched over her with the weight of duty more than tenderness. When Alfonsina, too, passed, Catherine's care fell into the hands of other relatives, her young life unsettled by shifting guardians and the restless politics of Florence. The city, with its narrow alleys and scent of oil lamps burning at dusk, was never far from conflict, for the Medici were both revered and reviled. Enemies saw in Catherine not a child, but a vessel of dynastic power, and so her safety was fragile. She was moved into convents, the walls of holy stone becoming both sanctuary and prison. It was said she found peace among the sisters, her small hands learning the feel of prayer beads, her ears filled with hymns rising in the chapel where morning light softened the cold stone. Yet even there, the turmoil of Florence reached her. In 1527, when she was 8 years old, the city rose against Medici rule, and Catherine became a pawn in the fury of politics. Captured by rebels, threatened, and used as a bargaining tool, the girl lived days when death seemed close. Some spoke of plans to place her in brothels, to disgrace her lineage. Others thought to hold her as hostage until the Medici might be restored. That she survived such years was less the work of fortune than of the watchful eyes of her distant kin and the ceaseless turning of political wheels. In time, the Medici returned to Florence with the strength of imperial arms, and Catherine was restored to her family's care. By then, the young girl had grown cautious, silent and observant, qualities that would mark her character throughout her life. One might ask, was the seed of the Black Queen already sown in the cloisters of her childhood, where fear and solitude trained her heart to wait and endure? Her great-uncle, Pope Clement VII, recognized her as a valuable instrument of alliance. He searched across Europe for a match that might secure both Florence and Rome against the currents of power. So it was that Catherine, still but 14 years old, was promised to Henry of Orleans, second son of King Francis III of France. The marriage was arranged not out of affection, but from necessity, as all royal unions then were, a knot of politics tied by young hands. When the girl was prepared for her journey, Florence adorned her with riches, yet perhaps she felt more the weight of farewell. She would leave behind the land of her birth for a realm where suspicion of Italians, and especially of the Medicis, ran deep. Her trousseau was magnificent. Silks, jewels, and tapestries, treasures that glittered like promises. But what can riches avail against the silence of a foreign chamber? In October 1533, Catherine arrived in Marseille for her marriage to Henry, Duke of Orléans. The sea air carried both salt and incense, for the city welcomed her with ceremony befitting her station. She met her husband, a boy of the same age, shy and reserved. Their union was celebrated in grandeur, yet beneath the gold and pageantry there lingered whispers among the French nobility. She was no princess of Spain, nor of the empire, but a Medici, a merchant's child, tainted by the shadow of banking wealth. Thus, she began her life in France beneath the glance of suspicion. As the wedding feast ended and the torches dimmed, the girl who had been a Florentine orphan found herself a Duchess of France, her fate bound now to a land where she was stranger and bride both. In the hushed stillness of that chamber, where the tapestries of saints watched silently, Catherine must have wondered what awaited her in this new country. The years ahead would prove them years of silence, of waiting, of watching. She lived for a time on the margins of the French court, her role ceremonial, her presence tolerated. Her husband Henry showed little affection. Reserved, almost aloof, he revealed little of his heart to her. And worse still, another woman soon came to dominate his life, Diane de Poitiers, 20 years his senior, who became his beloved mistress. Catherine endured in quiet, for she had no power to resist, and any misstep might have placed her in disgrace. But patience can be a kind of strength, a gathering of shadows before the dawn of influence. Catherine learned to observe, to keep her thoughts veiled. In the grand halls of Fontainebleau, in the candle-lit chambers of the Louvre, she stood with calm eyes, her words few, her gestures measured. Yet all the while she was learning, memorizing the movements of court, the alliances, the enmities. Was it here, in the long corridors of silence, that she began to shape the art of waiting that would one day define her reign? The footsteps of Florence seemed still to echo in her memory, and now new footsteps passed through the halls of France. Each one reminded her of a world that could turn against her in an instant. She did not shine then, nor wield power, but she endured. And in endurance, power sometimes begins. The candles in her bridal chamber flickered and dimmed, leaving shadows that seemed to linger, as if waiting to speak. The candlelight in her bridal chamber trembled and faded, and with it went the warmth of any dream of love that Catherine may have carried across the mountains of her homeland. What remained was the pale glow of duty, the shadow of doubt, and the stillness of a husband who rarely turned his eyes toward her. Henry of Orléans, though bound to her by the sacred rites of marriage, gave his heart and much of his loyalty to another, Diane de Poitiers, whose elegance and confidence dazzled the French court. Catherine, still a girl of 14, was left to occupy the silent spaces where whispers carried farther than words of comfort. In those early years, she walked softly through the long galleries of Fontainebleau and the cool chambers of the Louvre, her presence almost a footnote in the grandeur of her new family. Her dowry had been rich, her Medici name powerful in Italy, but among the French nobles she was seen as foreign, a stranger in a realm that guarded its traditions and mistrusted the influence of Florence. They muttered that she was no daughter of kings, that her blood was tainted by commerce and banking, that she brought not a crown but shadows of merchant halls. Each glance, each murmur, reminded her of her precarious place. Still, Catherine did not falter. She watched, she listened, she learned. In silence, she cultivated the art of presence without intrusion, an art as valuable at court as any jewel. She knew that to survive, she must not challenge Diane de Poitiers, nor press Henry for affection, but rather wait, endure, and prepare for a future that she could not yet see. It was a future uncertain, yet she sensed it would one day offer her a place not in the margins, but at the center. Years passed, and her marriage, though solemn in ceremony, remained barren of children. This absence weighed upon her more heavily than any whispered insult. In an age when queens were measured by their ability to bear heirs, Catherine's womb became the subject of speculation, of gossip, of cruel rumor. Physicians and midwives were summoned, potions and prayers were tried, remedies of ancient knowledge pressed upon her. Some whispered that she had been cursed, that her Medici blood carried hidden poison. Others mocked that she was unfit to be a mother, and therefore unfit to be a queen. The threat of annulment loomed, for Henry, though he showed her little affection, was expected to continue his line. And yet, Catherine endured. She turned to the sciences and the arts of medicine, consulting not only doctors but also astrologers, alchemists, and herbalists. Some of these figures would later feed the rumors that she trafficked in darker arts. But for her, then, they were simply means of hope. She consumed strange remedies, endured treatments, and offered prayers. And at last, when many had ceased to expect it, she bore children. Not one, but 10 in all, though several would die young, as was the sorrow of that century. In this triumph of motherhood, Catherine secured her place in France, for she had provided heirs, and the fragile thread of her influence was woven tighter into the fabric of the crown. Still, Henry's heart did not turn toward her. His loyalty to Diane de Poitiers remained unshaken, and Catherine, though now mother to the children of France, was forced to yield precedence to her rival. It was Diane who wore the jewels that Henry gifted, Diane who advised him in matters of state, Diane whose presence lit the court. Catherine, though queen in all but title, lived in the shadow of another woman. Yet in that shadow she learned once again the strength of patience. She watched Diane, studied her influence, and in the quiet chambers of her own solitude, she measured the ways in which affection, beauty, and power might weave together. Catherine's Italian ways set her apart from the French ladies of the court. She brought with her the flavors and scents of Florence, new dishes spiced with unfamiliar herbs, fashions cut in styles unseen before, and an interest in architecture, art, and learning. Some found her innovations strange, even threatening. Yet over time, they seeped into the fabric of French life. The fork, the orange, the delicacies of her homeland all became part of the court's table. In such subtle ways, Catherine left her mark, though few would yet give her credit. At night, when the halls fell silent and only the crackle of the fire kept watch, Catherine's thoughts must have wandered back to Florence, to the convent walls, to the voices of hymns echoing in stone. Did she recall then the loneliness of her childhood and find in it the mirror of her present life? Perhaps it was in those moments when the court slept that she began to weave within herself the resolve to endure whatever came, to prepare for a time when patience would turn into authority. The years stretched, and still Henry lived under the influence of Diane. Catherine did not rebel, nor show resentment, but she held herself steady. She raised her children with care, though even there Diane's presence intruded, for Henry often entrusted their upbringing more to his mistress than to their mother. Such was the indignity Catherine bore. Yet in the stillness of her endurance, something grew within her, a resolve as hard as stone, a determination born of countless humiliations. The court, glittering with tournaments, feasts, and intrigues, scarcely noticed the quiet Florentine duchess who kept herself apart. But history would notice, for in her silence Catherine was gathering the lessons of survival, the knowledge of faces, words, and gestures that would one day guide her hand upon the kingdom itself. And so the candlelight of her bridal chamber, which had once flickered with doubt, now gave way to the light of mornings where she walked quietly through the corridors, her eyes lowered, her heart veiled, yet her spirit unbroken. the rustle of silk gowns around her, the laughter of courtiers passing in groups, the whispers of ladies who mocked her, all these were sounds that shaped her, that pressed upon her but did not break her. She was an Italian in a French court, a wife in name but not in love, a mother whose children were half hers and half claimed by another. She was a shadow in those years, but shadows can lengthen until they cover the earth. The sound of silk rustling behind closed doors followed her everywhere, reminding her of the presence of Diane de Poitiers, of Henry's devotion elsewhere, of her own exclusion. Yet Catherine, who had endured convent walls, rebels' threats, and the loneliness of a foreign land, knew how to wait, and wait she did, silently, patiently, with eyes that saw more than she revealed, and with a heart that began to understand that power was not seized in haste, but gathered, piece by piece, in silence. The rustling of silk grew louder, as if it were a constant echo in the chambers of her life, a sound that lingered even in the stillness of night. The rustling of silk was never far, a sound that seeped through the walls like an uninvited guest. Behind those doors walked Diane de Poitiers, graceful and commanding, adorned with the favors that should have been Catherine's, yet worn by another. Diane was no ordinary mistress, but a woman of great poise and cunning, 20 years Henry's senior, who seemed to cast a spell upon him that neither time nor duty could dissolve. In the French court, it was not Catherine, the wife and duchess, who held sway, but Diane, the mistress, who received jewels, lands, and even the tokens of royal authority. Catherine was forced to yield precedence to her, a humiliation that few queens could have endured. There were times when Catherine, seated at banquets or processions, would see Diane step forward with the confidence of a sovereign, her hand resting lightly upon Henry's arm, her eyes sparkling with the knowledge of her dominion. The courtiers followed suit, bending their courtesy toward the mistress while scarcely sparing the queenly bride a glance. Catherine bore it all with downcast eyes, her silence a shield. She learned in those long years of submission that anger revealed too quickly only armed one's enemies. Better, perhaps, to hold it within, to let it harden into resolve. It was in this long humiliation that Catherine's nature was tempered, like iron in the slow fire. Day after day she endured the sting of Diane's ascendancy, but she did not lash out, nor did she fall into despair. Instead, she observed, and with the sharpness of one accustomed to survival, she learned the subtle paths of influence. She studied how Diane commanded Henry's loyalty, how she charmed the court, how she transformed personal affection into political authority. Catherine's own presence remained muted, her words cautious, her demeanor almost meek. Yet behind her silence, she gathered knowledge, and knowledge would one day become her armor. The court of France in those years glittered with tournaments, masques, and feasts. The brilliance of King Francis were casting its glow across Europe. But beneath the splendor, divisions simmered, factions whispered, ambitions clashed. Catherine, though sidelined, was not blind. She watched the noble houses contend for favor. She listened to the murmurs of the Guise and the Bourbon, and she marked the restless currents of religion that stirred between Catholic and Protestant. All this she stored quietly within her mind, as if preparing for an hour yet to come. Yet even in these years of humiliation, there were moments when her role as wife and duchess carried weight. Henry, though cold, did not set her aside. He permitted her to remain, to bear his children, to fulfill the sacred duty of lineage. For this, Catherine clung to her position with unyielding grip. She knew that as long as she gave heirs to the crown, her place could not be wholly usurped. And so she bore child after child, the palace echoing with the cries of infants, though the care of many was entrusted more to Diane than to her. Each child was both victory and reminder of her subjugation. Still, she endured. And perhaps, as she walked through the gardens of Fontainebleau, With their fountains and sculpted hedges, she reflected upon the irony of her life. Born into the greatest banking dynasty of Florence, elevated to the court of France, she was yet forced to live in another woman's shadow. Was this her fate, to be forever second? Or was it merely the long trial through which destiny prepared her? There were whispers, too, darker than the silken rustle of Diane's gowns. Whispers that Catherine, in her frustration, turned to occult practices, to astrologers and seers who promised glimpses of the future. It was said she kept close the Italian astrologer Cosimo Ruggieri, who charted the heavens for her, who whispered secrets drawn from stars and planets. Whether this was truth or rumor matters less than the fact that such stories grew, and with them, the aura of mystery that would cling to her name. Even in her silence, Catherine began to be seen as other, foreign, a figure surrounded by unseen influences. The humiliation under Diane was not only personal, but political. When Henry ascended in 1547 as King Henry II, it was not Catherine, his queen, who received the crown's tokens of trust, but Diane. She was granted the royal jewels, lands, and the authority to seal letters with the king's emblem. It was she who stood beside Henry in decisions, she who shaped policies. Catherine, the rightful queen, was left to watch, her face composed, her spirit disciplined. Few could imagine then that this same quiet woman, dismissed by many, would one day hold France itself in her grasp. The sound of silk in the corridors became to Catherine more than an annoyance. It was a constant reminder of her place, a reminder that every banquet, every courtly gathering belonged to Diane more than to herself. Yet that sound, persistent and inescapable, also became a teacher. For Catherine learned from it patience, humility, endurance. She learned to cloak her thoughts, to hide ambition beneath courtesy, to wait until the hour when the silken rustle would no longer dominate the corridors, when it would fade, and another sound, her own authority, would rise. In those long years, Catherine became known as a woman of great composure. She spoke rarely, smiled carefully, moved with deliberation. Those who dismissed her as insignificant saw only the surface. Beneath that surface, Catherine was gathering herself, as one gathers fuel for a fire not yet lit. Every humiliation, every slight, every silence added to the hidden store of resolve. And so it was that the rustling of silk behind closed doors did not break her. It shaped her. It forced her into the discipline of waiting, into the art of watching. And when at last fortune turned and the silken rustle ceased, she would be ready to step forward, not as shadow but as power. The rustling faded one night, leaving in its place the sudden hush of death, for Henry II's reign would soon come to a violent end, and with it, Diane's dominion. But in the meantime, Catherine endured, her patience as endless as the corridors she walked. The sound of silk lingered still, faint in the darkness, as if echoing long after the gowns had passed from view. The faint rustling of silk lingered like a ghost in the air, yet in time it was joined by a new sound, deeper and more solemn, the tolling of bells. They rang across the towns and fields of France in 1547, for Henry, Duke of Orleans, had ascended the throne as Henry II, King of France, and so Catherine at last became queen consort. The coronation was a spectacle of magnificence, banners unfurled, altars adorned, and nobles arrayed in gleaming garments. Yet even in that moment, when the crown was set upon her husband's head and Catherine herself took her place as queen, she remained overshadowed. For Diane de Poitiers, her rival, the king's beloved, stepped into the light as though she too had been crowned. It was Diane who received the crown jewels, Diane whose emblem intertwined with the king's, Diane who signed documents with his seal. The courtiers turned their admiration upon her, leaving Catherine with the hollow honor of titles. The crown upon her head weighed heavy, for it was not the emblem of power, but the symbol of endurance. To be queen and yet not sovereign, to bear the title and yet be denied its influence. Such was the paradox of Catherine's role. She was draped in gold, her brow adorned with pearls, but she lived still in another's shadow. The tolling of the bells, though, carried beyond ceremony. They called Catherine into a new season of her life, one where the stakes grew sharper, where the rivalries of court deepened, where the faiths of the kingdom pressed against one another with dangerous force. France was not at peace. Beneath the splendor of the Valois crown, the rumblings of division shook the ground. Protestants, known as Huguenots, grew bolder, their gatherings spreading, their voices rising. The Catholic majority bristled, fearful of heresy, and the nobility, restless as ever, sought to use faith as weapon and banner alike. Into this cauldron Catherine stepped as queen, her children the fragile heirs of an unstable kingdom. She was no longer merely a wife overlooked. She was now the mother of France's future kings, and this gave her a stake that even Diane's influence could not wholly erase. Still, she was careful. Catherine never confronted Diane openly, never risked Henry's wrath, but she remained steadfast in her place beside him. If her husband's love belonged to another, she at least kept her role as mother to his heirs, a role no mistress could claim. 10 children she bore, though many would not live long, as was the cruel rhythm of those times. Yet 3 of her sons would wear the crown of France, and through them Catherine's legacy would be bound inseparably to the kingdom's fate. The coronation bells faded into daily life, where tournaments and feasts filled the calendar of Henry's reign. Henry was a man of pride and valor, eager to prove himself in contests of arms. His love of chivalry led him often into the lists, where lances shattered and banners flew. Catherine, in her place, watched from balconies, her eyes veiled, her face composed. She knew that each tilt of the lance, each reckless charge carried danger, and in that danger lay the seeds of destiny. For Henry's life, like all lives, was a fragile thread, and should it break, all the realm would look not to Diane, but to Catherine, the crowned queen, the mother of heirs. In quieter hours, Catherine immersed herself in the duties of court life. She arranged entertainments, sponsored artists and architects, and introduced refinements from her Florentine heritage. The gardens of the Tuileries, the magnificence of banquets, the staging of elaborate festivals, all bore the mark of her influence. Though Diane often received the credit, Catherine was the one who brought the elegance of Italy into the French court, weaving art and ceremony into the daily fabric of royalty. Yet she did so without pressing her own name, content for now to plant seeds in silence, and always her mind turned to her children. She guided them with care, though Henry often entrusted their upbringing to Diane's supervision. Catherine bore this indignity as she had borne others, her patience unbroken. She did not yet grasp the reins of power, but she prepared those who would inherit them. The lessons she gave her sons were not merely of courtesy and learning, but of vigilance, endurance, and the art of survival. For she knew that the crown of France rested not upon unshaken ground, but upon shifting sands. As queen consort, she also encountered the challenge of faith. France was bleeding into conflict between Catholic and Protestant, and Catherine, though devoutly Catholic, recognized the peril of division. She sought to ease tensions, to counsel moderation, but her voice was seldom the one Henry heeded. He listened more to Diane, more to his own pride, more to those who urged suppression of heresy by fire and sword. Catherine, meanwhile, learned that her instinct for balance and compromise, though rarely followed now, would one day become her guiding principle. The bells that had tolled at Henry's coronation seemed to toll again in Catherine's heart, not in joy but in forewarning. She could sense that destiny would not long leave her in the shadows. The kingdom itself was restless, its factions sharpening their blades, its faiths preparing for war. Henry, strong though he seemed, was mortal, and in that mortality lay the turning of the wheel. Catherine, who had waited so long in silence, began to see that her waiting might soon come to an end. Still, she kept her composure. In the halls of Fontainebleau she walked with quiet grace, her gowns whispering against the stone floors. In the Louvre she arranged festivities, her presence courteous, her smile measured. Yet within, she was no longer merely the orphan girl from Florence, nor the slighted wife in a foreign court. She was queen, and though overshadowed, she was prepared. And so the bells that had rung for Henry's crowning tolled also for Catherine's endurance. They marked the paradox of her life, crowned yet overshadowed, honored yet dismissed, present yet unseen. But beneath the paradox, the shape of destiny was forming, and the crown, though now a weight upon her brow, would one day become her shield and her weapon alike. As the bells faded into the distance, their sound lingered like an echo in the air, merging with the memory of tournaments, the laughter of courtiers, and the silent prayers of a queen who waited. And then, into this world of glitter and festivity, came the sharp, splintering sound of a lance breaking, a sound that would shatter the course of her life. The splintering sound of the lance broke the summer air, sharp as thunder across a clear sky. It was June of 1559, and King Henry II, proud and strong, had taken part in a joust to celebrate the marriage of his daughter Elizabeth to Philip of Spain. The tournament field at Paris was alive with banners, cheers, and the thunder of hooves. Catherine watched from her balcony, her face composed, her heart steady, though always she carried that quiet fear of her husband's reckless pride in such contests. She had seen lances break before, had heard the cries of the crowd, but this time the sound carried deeper, heavier. The splinter of wood became the splinter of destiny. The king's opponent, Gabriel de Montgomery, struck with force. The lance shattered, a long fragment piercing Henry's eye and lodging deep into his skull. In an instant, the celebration collapsed into chaos. The shouts of joy turned to screams. The gallop of horses gave way to the rush of physicians. Catherine watched, her silence unbroken. But within her heart, she knew the crown was already shifting, already slipping. For days Henry lingered, suffering in agony. The surgeons, with their instruments and their prayers, tried in vain to remove the fragment. The court grew hushed, the air thick with incense and whispered fears. Catherine remained near, not with the frantic devotion of Diane de Poitiers, but with the solemn steadiness of one who saw beyond the bed, beyond the flesh, into the corridors of power already being rearranged. She knew that the death of the king would end not only his reign, but also Diane's dominion. The mistress who had ruled through his affection would find her influence dissolved in an instant, for widows are not bound by rivals, and regents bow to no mistress. When Henry died on the 10th of July, the bells tolled again, but this time their sound was not one of coronation, but of mourning. France wept for its king, struck down not in battle, but in sport. Yet as the people grieved, Catherine stepped forward into a role she had long awaited. Her eldest son, Francis II, was but 15 years old, weak of body, unsteady of spirit. It was Catherine who must guide him, Catherine who must guard the fragile crown. At last, the years of silence, the endurance of humiliation, the patience beneath the rustle of silk, all had led to this moment. She was Queen Mother, and in that title lay the true weight of power. The corridors of the Louvre changed in an instant. Where once Diane's silks had rustled with authority, now Catherine's darker gowns brushed against the stones. Diane was dismissed from court, her jewels and lands reclaimed, her presence diminished. Catherine, with calm hand, closed the doors upon her rival's influence, not with rage but with the inevitability of time. She had waited, and time had delivered. Yet if victory had come, it came at a cost. Francis II was delicate, sickly, and inconstant. His reign would be short, his health fragile, his mind swayed easily by those around him. The powerful Guise family, Catholic and ambitious, pressed close to him, seeking to dominate the crown through his weakness. Catherine, though Queen Mother, found herself yet again surrounded by rivals, her authority challenged by the ambition of great houses. Still, she did not falter. She moved carefully, weaving between factions, balancing the Guise against the Bourbon, seeking not to dominate, but to survive and to preserve the throne for her sons. France, too, grew restless. The Huguenots, emboldened by the young king's weakness, pushed more boldly for their faith, while the Catholics demanded harsh repression. The wars of religion loomed on the horizon, a storm that Catherine could already sense, though its full fury had not yet broken. In the midst of this turbulence, she stood as regent, not by official decree, for the Guise sought to claim that role, but by the quiet force of her presence, as mother of the king. The days after Henry's death were filled with councils, treaties, and rumors. Catherine moved through them like a figure of patience, her words measured, her gaze steady. She had endured too long to squander her place now. Her children were the crown's future, and she would guard them with every fiber of her being. Was it love that drove her, or ambition, or the mingling of both, inseparable as breath and life? Perhaps even she did not know, for in her heart the mother and the sovereign were bound so tightly that one could not be distinguished from the other. In her chambers, Catherine lit candles and prayed, the wax dripping slowly as if measuring time itself. She prayed not only for her son's health, but for the strength to guide him, for the wisdom to preserve France. Outside, the bells continued to toll, their mournful sound filling the city, their echoes rising to the vaulted ceilings of churches, drifting through the narrow streets. Each toll was both lament and summons, for with Henry's death a new chapter began. Catherine's face remained solemn, her presence calm, yet within her burned the memory of the lance, the broken splinter, the cry of the crowd. That moment of violence had torn away the veil of her long subjugation and thrust her into the light. She had not sought her husband's death, yet she could not deny that in it lay her liberation. The paradox of fate had once again shaped her path. Grief and power intertwined, loss and opportunity joined as one. And so Catherine, the once orphaned Florentine, the once humbled bride, the once shadowed queen, became the mother of France, the regent in all but name. The bells that tolled for Henry's death also tolled for her arrival into true authority. From the splinter of a lance, the destiny of a kingdom had shifted, and Catherine, at last, stood ready to shape its course. The sound of the broken lance still echoed in her memory, sharp and unfinished, as though its splintering had not ended with Henry's fall but continued to break across the years, a sound that would echo through her reign, through her children, through the very soil of France. The echo of the lance remained, splintered and sharp, but in Catherine's chambers the sound was joined by another, softer and slower, the turning of a heavy page in a prayer book. She would often sit in silence, the tall candles flickering around her, the Latin words before her blurred not only by time, but by the weight of thoughts that had little to do with the saints or the Psalms. Each page she turned seemed less a prayer and more a reckoning with fate. Her son Francis II, barely crowned, was already fading. His body, delicate from birth, was racked with illness, his reign brief as a candle caught by a draught. Catherine, who had waited so long for the moment to guide her children, found herself again confronted with fragility. Francis was only 15 when he inherited the throne, a boy king, easily swayed by those who pressed closest. The Guise family, proud Catholics, fierce and ambitious, seized upon him as their instrument. They surrounded him with counsel, wrapped his crown with their banners, and pushed Catherine aside, as if the Queen Mother were a figure of courtesy and nothing more. Yet Catherine had learned in the silence of her youth, in the long shadow of Diane de Poitiers, that to be overlooked was not defeat. To be overlooked was opportunity. She watched as the guys tightened their grip, using Francis to advance their cause, pressing harsh measures upon the Huguenots, seeking to crush the Protestant voice that had begun to rise in France. But repression bred only greater resistance, and whispers of conspiracy filled the air. In 1560, there came the conspiracy of Amboise, a failed plot by Huguenot nobles to seize the young king and free him from the Guise influence. The rebellion was crushed, the conspirators executed, their bodies displayed as warning. Catherine, though not its architect, understood the lesson. France was splitting, faith against faith, and the crown itself stood upon trembling ground. At night, when Francis coughed in his chamber, Catherine's heart carried both fear and calculation. She was his mother, bound by blood, yet she also saw in his weakness the shifting of destiny. If Francis died, the crown would pass to her next son, Charles, still a child, and she would at last claim the regency openly, not only in spirit but in law. The thought was bitter. The thought was necessary. A mother's sorrow and a sovereign's ambition are not easily divided, and in Catherine they were woven tightly, each breath a mixture of grief and determination. And then in December of 1560, the inevitable came. Francis II died, not yet 17, his reign scarcely more than a year. The bells tolled again over Paris, mournful, relentless, and Catherine once more turned the heavy page of her life. With his death, her second son, Charles IX, only 10 years of age, ascended the throne. Now at last Catherine was named regent, her authority no longer shadowed by mistresses or overbearing families. The crown lay in the hands of a child, and the kingdom in the keeping of his mother. It was a fragile crown she held. France was restless, its nobility divided, its faith torn. The Catholics, led by the Guise, demanded blood and fire against heresy. The Huguenots, led by the Bourbon princes, demanded tolerance and recognition. Between them, Catherine stood, not with zeal but with caution. She was Catholic by birth and conviction, yet she understood that relentless repression would destroy the kingdom, while unchecked Protestant strength would undermine the crown. Thus she sought a path of balance, a narrow road between fury and rebellion. In January of 1562, Catherine issued the Edict of Saint-Germain, granting limited toleration to the Protestants, allowing them to worship outside city walls. It was a bold gesture, born not of conviction in their creed, but of conviction in survival. She hoped to calm the fires, to keep the kingdom from splintering. Yet peace is rarely welcomed by those who thirst for victory. The Catholics raged at her leniency, the Huguenots distrusted her motives, and in March, the Massacre of Valois, where Catholic troops slaughtered Protestant worshippers, ignited the flames of the wars of religion. Thus began decades of conflict, wars that would scar France with blood and grief, wars in which Catherine would play the role of mediator, manipulator, and survivor. She traveled tirelessly through the land, meeting nobles, negotiating treaties, arranging marriages, always seeking some fragile truce that might hold long enough for her children to grow, long enough for the crown to endure. Yet each peace dissolved, each truce broken, and the cycle of violence turned again. In these years, Catherine's reputation began to darken. Whispers of her consultations with astrologers grew louder. Tales of poisons and secret plots spread through France and beyond. She was seen as cunning, manipulative, willing to turn from side to side as necessity demanded. Was this truth? Or was it the inevitable shadow cast upon a woman who held power in a man's world? History does not answer with certainty. It shows us only a mother guarding her sons, a queen preserving her crown, a ruler navigating storms where others might have drowned. In the stillness of her prayer chambers, Catherine turned the heavy pages again, her hands steady, her eyes shadowed. Did she find solace in the words, or only the echo of her own doubts? Did she believe that her balancing act served God's will, or did she fear that she merely postponed the kingdom's ruin? Such questions remain, lingering like the faint scent of incense long after the candles have burned away. Outside, the kingdom moved restlessly. Soldiers marched, sermons thundered, families divided by creed turned against one another. Catherine, regent and mother, walked among them with her measured steps, her dark eyes watching, her words carefully chosen. She was not loved, not trusted, yet she was necessary. Without her, the fragile crown might have shattered completely. With her, it endured, trembling but unbroken. The page turned again, heavy as fate, and the sound echoed in her chamber as if each word written there weighed more than gold. The heavy page of the prayer book turned, and with it came a gentler sound, almost fragile, the faint laughter of a child king. Charles IX was only 10 when he inherited the crown, his voice still thin with youth, his steps unsteady upon floors built for men of power. In the grand chambers of the Louvre, his laughter would echo briefly and then fade, swallowed by the heavy stones, as though the palace itself reminded him that joy had little place in a kingdom torn by faith and war. Catherine, his mother, watched him closely, her eyes holding both tenderness and calculation. He was her son, yes, the child of her womb, but he was also France itself, and every breath he took carried the future of the crown. She became regent in truth now, not only in appearance. The great nobles might rage, the Guys might scheme, the Bourbons might protest, yet Catherine's hand guided the throne. She held council, she weighed edicts, she arranged marriages, and always she kept her children close, weaving their lives into the fragile web of her strategy. The faint laughter of Charles was more than a child's delight. It was the sound of her legacy, the promise of continuity. Yet behind that laughter, she heard the echo of peril. For a boy king was vulnerable, easily swayed, easily broken. Catherine poured her energy into shaping Charles. She surrounded him with tutors, with counselors of her choosing, though always balancing factions so that none could claim sole influence. She taught him caution, the value of appearances, the necessity of endurance. Yet he was still a child, prone to games, to sudden outbursts, to moods that shifted like weather. When he played with his siblings in the palace gardens, his laughter rang pure. Yet when he sat in council chambers, his small hands clenched the armrest of his chair as though to steady himself against a world too vast for his grasp. And around him, the kingdom shook. The wars of religion had begun in earnest. Battles scarred the land, towns burned, rivers ran red. Catherine moved tirelessly across France, her carriages rattling over cobblestones, her presence constant in cities torn by division. She sought to broker peace, to calm passions, to bring nobles to truce. Often she succeeded for a time. Treaties were signed, edicts proclaimed, promises exchanged. Yet each peace was temporary, each truce fragile, for suspicion ran too deep and faith too fierce. The faint laughter of her son echoed always against a background of distant drums, the march of armies, the cries of exiles. In these years, Catherine's image began to harden in the minds of those who watched her. To the Catholics, she seemed too lenient, to the Huguenots too cautious, to both too changeable. She shifted as necessity demanded, sometimes favoring one side, then another, always with the crown's survival in mind. But in a world where faith demanded certainty, her balancing act was seen as cunning, manipulative, even sinister. Tales of her reliance on astrologers, on secret councils, on potions and poisons grew louder. She was painted as a woman who trafficked in shadows, who whispered to the stars, who walked with sorcerers. Whether she believed in such arts or merely used them as tools of perception, the reputation clung to her, feeding the name she would carry into legend, the Black Queen. Yet beneath the rumors was the reality of a mother who feared for her child. Charles grew older but not stronger. He was nervous, often ill, prone to sudden fits of anger or despair. His laughter grew rarer, his moods darker. Catherine held him close, soothing him when she could, guiding him when she must, shielding him from those who would use him as their instrument. She had endured silence in her own youth, endured humiliation in her marriage, and now she endured uncertainty in her motherhood. Always, endurance was her weapon. The palace in these years was both cradle and cage. Catherine filled it with entertainments, with pageants and masks, hoping to distract the court from its divisions. She arranged hunts, tournaments, banquets, bringing moments of glitter to a kingdom dimmed by war. Charles, still a boy at heart, found joy in these spectacles, his laughter ringing for a time above the music of lutes and the clatter of dishes. Yet even in celebration, the divisions pressed close. Nobles eyed one another across the tables, priests muttered against heresy, ambassadors sent reports heavy with suspicion. Catherine smiled, spoke softly, arranged seats with care, but she knew that beneath the laughter and the wine, the fracture of France widened. She also began to see in Charles a reflection of herself. He too was caught between forces greater than him, forced to balance, forced to wear a mask. Did she pity him for this fate, or did she see in him the continuation of her own path? Perhaps both. A mother's heart cannot be divided from a sovereign's duty, and Catherine carried both within her as one. At night, when the palace grew quiet, she would hear Charles's laughter in her memory, faint as though from a far corridor. It reminded her that he was still a child, still fragile, still needing her hand. It reminded her also of the fleeting nature of joy, of the way laughter can vanish into silence, just as peace vanishes into war. She listened, she remembered, and she resolved to protect that laughter as long as she could, even if the world condemned her methods. The faint laughter of the child king lingered in the air, but behind it rose another sound, distant yet unmistakable, the low rumble of smoke rising from fields and villages, the unrest of a kingdom not at peace. The faint laughter of the child king drifted away, and in its place rose the low rumble of smoke rising across fields and villages, the distant unrest of a kingdom bleeding. France was not at peace. The Edict of Saint-Germain had been written with the hope of calming the flames, yet flames are not so easily tamed, and by 1562 the wars of religion had burst into full fire. Catherine, as regent, found herself in a land torn as though by an earthquake, Catholic against Huguenot, noble against noble, city against city. The smoke that rose from distant towns carried not only the scent of burning wood, but also the stench of mistrust and vengeance. Catherine sought to stand between the factions, not as an impartial judge. She was Catholic, bound by birth and devotion, but as a guardian of survival. She did not believe France could endure if either side were wholly crushed, nor if either side claimed complete triumph. Thus she sought compromise, truce, the weaving of fragile treaties like silk threads stretched across a chasm. Yet silk cannot hold against iron, and each thread she wove was torn again by the swords of men who refused to bend. The First War brought the horror of Vassy, where the Duke of Guise's soldiers cut down Protestants at worship, blood staining the earth of a simple barn. News of the massacre spread like wildfire, fueling rage and retaliation. Battles followed: Dreux, Orléans, Jarnac, Moncontour, each leaving fields littered with corpses, each driving deeper the division that Catherine sought to mend. She rode from camp to camp, from court to battlefield, her carriages creaking under the weight of long journeys, her face pale but composed. She pleaded for peace. She signed edicts. She arranged parleys, always striving to bring the factions to table. Yet peace never held, and with each collapse her reputation grew darker. To the Catholics, she seemed a traitor, granting the Huguenots too much. To the Huguenots, she seemed a deceiver, giving promises she could not keep. To both, she became the figure of suspicion, the woman in black who whispered not prayers but schemes. They accused her of double-dealing, of playing one side against the other, of using peace not for reconciliation but for delay. Yet Catherine pressed on, for she knew that her children's crown rested on the survival of the monarchy itself, not upon the triumph of one faith over another. At the same time, she sought to strengthen the monarchy's image through spectacle. Catherine loved the arts, the grandeur of pageants, the illusion of harmony. She staged festivals in which Catholic and Protestant nobles danced together, masks where myth and allegory clothed conflict in beauty. She believed that appearances could soothe, that art could bind where politics failed. For a moment, under the painted skies of these spectacles, peace seemed possible. The music played, the dancers twirled, the torches blazed against the night. Yet when dawn came, smoke rose once more from villages, and the clash of arms resumed. It was during these years that her reputation as the Black Queen began to harden. She often dressed in mourning black, a widow's attire that she never abandoned after Henry II's death. The dark gowns, combined with her reliance on astrologers like Nostradamus, gave her an aura of the occult. Whispers spread of poison hidden in jeweled rings, of secret councils held at midnight, of powders and potions brewed in hidden chambers. Whether truth or slander, such stories grew because she was a woman who wielded power, and power in a woman often appeared unnatural to the eyes of her age. Thus the black of her attire became the black of legend, the shadow in which her name would dwell forever. Charles IX, growing older, was caught in this turmoil. His laughter became rarer, his moods more troubled. He was torn by the pressures of faith and faction, pulled one way by the Guise, another by the Bourbon, always under his mother's watchful eye. Catherine guided him as best she could, shielding him from extremes, urging him toward moderation. Yet the boy was fragile, his mind restless, his body prone to illness. He bore the weight of kingship poorly, and the burden only grew as the wars dragged on. Catherine saw this, and her heart, both as mother and regent, was torn. She wanted to protect him, yet she knew he must stand as king. Was she shielding him, or was she binding him? The question lingered, unanswered, like smoke that refuses to lift. France itself became a land of smoke, its towns smoldering, its people restless, its faiths unreconciled. Catherine traveled ceaselessly, her coaches rolling through war-torn fields, her presence both feared and needed. She negotiated, threatened, pleaded, and endured, always with the aim of preserving the monarchy. For she believed that if the crown fell, France itself would fracture beyond repair. The rumble of smoke grew heavier, drifting through the halls of the Louvre, clinging to tapestries, seeping even into chambers of prayer. Catherine smelled it always, in her hair, her garments, her skin. It was the scent of a kingdom on fire, a fire she could not extinguish, only control for a time. She moved like one carrying water in cupped hands, careful, deliberate, yet unable to prevent the spilling. And so the smoke rose, curling upward, blotting the skies of France, as Catherine continued her lonely task of balance. She was mistrusted, maligned, misunderstood, Yet still she endured, for endurance was her constant companion. The smoke did not clear. Instead, it drifted into the air of Paris, mingling with the sound of bells that rang for a wedding that was meant to bring peace, yet trembled already with unease. The bells of union began to toll, thin and uncertain, their sound like a question unanswered. The smoke of France's burning fields drifted into the city of Paris, where it mingled with the sound of bells. These were no funeral bells, nor the solemn toll of coronation, but the lighter chimes of a wedding day. Yet they trembled in the air with unease, as though even their metal voices foresaw the storm to come. It was August of 1572, and Catherine had arranged a marriage between her daughter, Margaret of Valois, and Henry of Navarre, the Protestant prince who stood at the head of the Huguenot cause. This union was meant to heal, to reconcile Catholic and Protestant, to weave peace between factions torn by a decade of war. The bells rang with promise, but beneath their music stirred doubt, mistrust, and the memory of smoke. Catherine had long believed that marriages could serve as bridges where treaties failed. She had used them before, binding her children to crowns across Europe. Now she sought to bind her daughter to the leader of the Huguenots, hoping that love, or at least kinship, might soften enmity. Yet even she must have known the fragility of such hope. For the Catholics muttered that it was folly to wed a princess of France to a heretic, while the Protestants whispered that Catherine's hand was too cunning to trust. The bells of Notre Dame rang out, but their sound was thin against the thick air of suspicion. The wedding itself glittered with grandeur. Margaret, radiant in her finery, walked through the cathedral, her brow crowned, her gown flowing like a river of silk. Henry of Navarre, watchful, carried himself with the restraint of one entering enemy territory. The court assembled in its splendor, nobles in bright attire, bishops in their robes, soldiers in polished armor. Yet even amid the music and the fragrance of flowers, the air was heavy. Outside, in the streets of Paris, tension simmered as Catholic citizens eyed the influx of Huguenot guests who had come to celebrate. The city, already restless, became a tinderbox, and the wedding bells struck not harmony, but dissonance. Catherine moved among the guests with her usual composure, her dark attire setting her apart from the brilliance around her. She smiled, she welcomed, she spoke words of reconciliation, but her eyes missed little. She saw the guarded looks, the whispered exchanges, the hands that rested too easily on sword hilts. She had built this moment with care, yet she must have sensed that it balanced upon a blade's edge. Still, she pressed forward, for she believed that without bold gestures, peace would never come. Margaret herself, spirited and intelligent, entered the marriage with reluctance. She had not chosen Navarre, nor loved him, yet she bowed to the will of family and crown. In her memoirs, written years later, she would recall the wedding day as one shrouded in foreboding, where joy was muted and dread ever near. Catherine, her mother, watched her daughter take vows not of love, but of necessity, and perhaps in her heart she wondered whether the crown demanded too much from the blood of her own children. For a brief moment it seemed the union might work. Banquets followed, dances filled the nights, and courtiers feasted upon the illusion of harmony. Yet beneath the feasts, rumors spread. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, leader of the Huguenots, walked openly in Paris, too confidently for the comfort of Catholic factions. He urged the king to take arms against Spain in the Netherlands, a policy that many Catholics opposed. Catherine, wary of his influence upon her son Charles Napoleon, felt her careful balance slipping. The Guise family, never idle, fanned the embers of suspicion, recalling old blood feuds with Coligny. Then, in the days after the wedding, an attempt was made upon Coligny's life. He was shot in the street, gravely wounded but not killed. At once the city fell into agitation. Huguenots cried out for justice, demanding that the king punish those responsible. Catholics murmured that retaliation was near. Catherine moved swiftly to calm her son, to assure him of control, yet she must have seen that the ground beneath her was cracking. The bells of marriage had scarcely faded, and already the city seemed poised to drown in blood. What passed in those hours within the Louvre remains clouded by centuries of debate. Did Catherine counsel her son to strike against the Huguenot leaders, fearing they might rise in vengeance? Did she seek merely to preserve the crown by preempting rebellion? Or was the massacre that followed born of panic, of rumor, of fear spiraling into frenzy? History does not tell us clearly. It leaves us with suspicion, accusation, and the haunting image of Catherine, the Black Queen standing in the shadows of decision. What is certain is that within days of the wedding bells, another sound filled Paris, the cries of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Huguenot leaders were slain, their followers hunted in the streets, their bodies thrown into the Seine. The city that had witnessed vows of unity now witnessed rivers of blood. Catherine's role in this remains shrouded. To some, she was the architect. To others, a desperate mother seeking to preserve her son's crown. The truth may lie somewhere in between, veiled as she herself was veiled in mourning black. The bells that had tolled for Margaret's wedding seem now to toll again, not in joy, but in dread, their notes echoing over a city of corpses. The union that was meant to heal had become the spark of slaughter, and Catherine's name was forever bound to its horror. And yet, in that dark moment, she remained steady. She comforted her son, who trembled under the weight of what had been done, his hands shaking, his voice faltering. She urged him to be strong, to claim the act as necessary, to stand as king. She shielded him even as she bore the blame, for she knew that without such shielding, the Valois crown would fall. The wedding bells lingered faintly in memory, their music trembling like a question unanswered, and beneath them rose the cries of a city that would never forget. The wedding bells faded into memory, their trembling notes scarcely remembered, for over them rose another sound, the cries of Paris under the moonlit sky. It was August 24th, 1572, the feast of St. Bartholomew, when the massacre began. From the windows of the Louvre, Catherine de Medici is said to have gazed upon the city, her face pale in the flickering light of torches, her eyes steady though the streets below churned with blood. The massacre had begun with the slaughter of Huguenot leaders gathered for Margaret's wedding, but it did not end there. It spilled into the houses of Paris, into alleys and squares, into the very river that bore the corpses of men, women, and children. The moon was said to hang full above the city, casting its pale glow upon rooftops and bridges, yet its light revealed not peace, but terror. Soldiers of the crown moved with orders, while mobs of citizens joined with frenzy, looting, killing, denouncing neighbors. The Seine flowed thick with bodies, its current carrying away the dead as though the city sought to cleanse itself, though no cleansing could wash away such horror. Bells tolled again, not for weddings, not for coronations, but as signals for attack. Houses were marked, doors broken, throats cut, fires set. Paris, the jewel of the kingdom, became a charnel house, and Catherine, the Queen Mother, stood at the center of its memory. Was she the architect, cold and calculating, who counseled her son that it was safer to cut down the Huguenot leaders than to risk rebellion? Or was she swept by the panic of a court, fearing imminent insurrection, choosing the path of slaughter as the lesser danger? Historians argue, yet the image endures. Catherine draped in black, the Black Queen, whose shadow fell upon the blood of thousands. Charles IX, her son, was shaken. It is said he trembled as reports of the killings poured into the palace, his voice breaking, his hands shaking, his face ghostly pale. Yet Catherine urged him to stand firm, to present the massacre as his will, not as chaos. "Then kill them all," he was rumored to have said in despair, words that echoed through time as a king's surrender to madness. Catherine, steady beside him, guided his fear into declaration, for she knew that hesitation might ruin the crown. The blood of Paris, she believed, must be born not by rumor but by royal command, else the monarchy itself would appear weak. For days the massacre raged, spreading from Paris to other towns as news traveled faster than control. Lyon, Orléans, Bordeaux, and more saw similar slaughter. Perhaps Catherine had never intended such vast horror. Perhaps she sought only to cut the head of rebellion and found instead that the body moved of its own accord. But intent matters little when streets run red. Her name was bound forever to the massacre, her reputation darkened across Europe, her image fixed as a queen of blood. Ambassadors wrote home of her cruelty, pamphlets painted her as a poisoner, a witch, a schemer beyond all measure. In Protestant lands, she was denounced as a Jezebel, the very embodiment of evil. Even in Catholic realms, unease lingered, for the scale of the massacre shocked all. Yet Catherine endured. She presented herself as the guardian of the crown, the protector of her son, the preserver of France against treachery. She bore the blame, she bore the whispers, but she did not falter. Within the Louvre, silence settled after the cries faded, yet silence was no comfort. Catherine walked the galleries, her dark gown trailing softly against the stones, her face unreadable. Did she feel triumph, or sorrow, or only necessity? The question lingers still. Perhaps she herself did not know, for a ruler who acts from fear may convince even herself that necessity is justice. Perhaps she whispered prayers for the souls of the dead, even as she steeled her heart for the judgment of the living. Charles, haunted, grew more unstable in the months that followed. He suffered fits of guilt, visions of the slain, nights without rest. He confessed to friends that blood followed him, that he heard cries in the silence of his chamber. Catherine watched him decline, her son both king and victim of the massacre, his laughter long since silenced. She had sought to preserve his throne, but in doing so, she had scarred his spirit. A mother's choice, a regent's decision, a queen's burden, all tangled into one. Outside, the kingdom trembled still. The massacre had not ended the wars, it had deepened them. Protestants fled, regrouped, hardened. Catholics rejoiced in the streets but grew wary of vengeance. Europe itself took notice, and France became a land feared, despised, whispered of in courts from London to Vienna. Catherine's name carried with it the smell of smoke and blood, her image cloaked in the black she always wore. Yet she pressed forward, unyielding, for there was no turning back. Once the streets had run red, one could not wash the stones clean. The cries of Paris lingered in the air long after the last sword was sheathed. They became whispers in corridors, shadows in alleys, the silent testimony of walls that had seen too much. Catherine carried those cries within her. Whether as guilt or as armor, no one could tell. She had chosen or been forced to choose, and the choice had bound her forever. As the moonlight dimmed and the nights grew colder, the city tried to return to life, markets reopening, bells ringing again for Mass. But beneath every sound lingered the echo of that night, the memory of torches, the rushing of feet, the screams. And Catherine, steady as ever, moved forward, her face calm, her eyes unreadable, her heart perhaps heavy, but her resolve unbroken. For she knew that the crown still stood, and as long as it did, she would endure. The cries of Paris faded slowly into the distance, but in their place rose a softer, more insidious sound, the hiss of unseen incense drifting through Catherine's court as rumors of her poisonings and occult practices spread like smoke into every chamber of Europe. The cries of Paris drifted into silence, But silence was soon filled by a subtler sound, a faint hiss, as of unseen incense curling through chambers and corridors. It was not the incense of prayer alone, but the scent of rumor, of suspicion, of whispered tales that spread faster than armies. Catherine de Medici, Queen Mother of France, was no longer remembered only as the widow in black, nor as the guardian of her sons. She became, in the eyes of Europe, a figure cloaked in shadow, whispered of as poisoner, as sorceress, as mistress of secrets hidden from the sun. At court, incense burned in golden censers during Mass, but in the streets and in foreign lands, the same smoke seemed to carry her reputation. Pamphlets and letters painted her as one who kept cabinets of poison, rings with hidden needles, perfumes that killed as swiftly as any blade. Some told of secret chambers in the Louvre where alchemists and astrologers gathered under her patronage, casting horoscopes, distilling potions, summoning spirits. Was any of this true? Perhaps fragments were. Catherine did indeed consult astrologers. She did indeed seek guidance in the stars, as many of her age did. Nostradamus himself once wrote prophecies for her, assuring her that her sons would reign. She did indeed support physicians and apothecaries, for she valued knowledge of remedies and the mysteries of the body. Yet rumor transformed these habits into something darker, making of her not a curious queen but a black magician, a witch whose power came not from wisdom but from the devil's whisper. The hiss of incense followed her wherever she went. When nobles fell ill suddenly, tongues wagged that Catherine had arranged it. When rivals met untimely deaths, whispers claimed poison flowed from her hand. Even her spectacles and perfumes became symbols of fear. In truth, poison was no stranger to that century. It was a weapon of politics, feared and sometimes used. But to attribute every death to Catherine was to weave a legend stronger than fact. And legend was what her enemies desired, for it served them better to paint her monstrous than to admit that her power lay in patience, calculation, and endurance. Catherine herself did little to dispel the aura. She did not laugh at the rumors, nor did she loudly deny them. Perhaps she understood that mystery was itself a form of power. If others feared her as a poisoner, they might hesitate to oppose her. If others believed she communed with astrologers, they might credit her with foresight. In a court where daggers hid beneath velvet sleeves, to be feared was sometimes safer than to be loved. Thus the incense hissed on, curling into every corner of Europe, staining her name with smoke. Within the palace, Catherine's entertainments continued. She staged festivals, masques, elaborate ballets, where allegory and myth clothed the realm in splendor. Her love of theater was deep, her belief in illusion profound. She knew that appearances could soothe, that beauty could distract from blood, that spectacle could mask division. Yet even these spectacles fed the whispers. To some, the elaborate dances seemed rituals, the allegories seemed spells, the music seemed enchantment. Her black gowns, always worn since Henry's death, lent her an air of the sorceress, the widow who never stepped back into the light. Charles IX, haunted by guilt, fell deeper into melancholy. His health declined, his mind tormented by visions of the massacre. Catherine watched him falter, even as she sought to guide him. Perhaps she whispered comfort, perhaps she urged him toward steadiness, but he remained fragile. When his body failed in 1574, coughing blood until his sheets were stained, Catherine wept as mother even while she prepared as regent. Another son, Henry, Duke of Anjou, would inherit, another crown to guard, another fragile thread to hold. And through it all, the hiss of incense lingered. The people spoke of her as if she held France in thrall by sorcery, as if every treaty she signed was sealed, not by ink, but by spell. Foreign courts spread tales of her cruelty, calling her the Black Queen, the Italian widow who drenched France in blood and perfumed her chambers with poison. Yet Catherine pressed forward, unbroken. She did not shrink from her dark reputation. She endured it as she endured all else. Perhaps she even drew strength from it, for shadows can conceal as much as they reveal. At night, when the torches burned low and the incense still curled faintly in the air, Catherine must have felt the weight of it, the burden of being both mother and monster, both protector and destroyer in the eyes of her world. Did she wonder how history would judge her? Or did she think only of the next day, the next council, the next war, the next child to be shielded by her hands? The hiss gave no answer. It lingered, soft and ceaseless, like a breath that would not end. The incense thickened, filling not only her chambers but the very air of the court. And beyond the haze, faintly, came another sound, gentler, fading, but insistent. The distant music of a lute played at one of Catherine's splendid festivals, where illusion reigned for a brief hour over a kingdom of blood. The hiss of unseen incense lingered, curling through chamber and corridor, until at last it seemed to dissolve into a softer sound, the fading notes of a lute. The instrument played in one of Catherine's grand festivals, its strings plucked with delicate grace, the melody floating above the murmur of voices, above the rustle of gowns, above the weight of suspicion that pressed upon her court. For Catherine, these spectacles were not mere entertainments. They were armor, illusion, a way to paint harmony upon a canvas of discord. Her court became a theater where peace was staged even when war stalked the fields. She brought musicians and poets, dancers and architects, weaving their talents into pageants of astonishing beauty. Masks glimmered with allegory, their characters drawn from myth and scripture, their meanings layered so that courtiers might read them as both play and counsel. Gardens were transformed into enchanted groves, halls into glittering palaces of art. The people marveled, the nobles applauded, yet beneath the applause, Catherine's intent was steady, to distract, to soothe, to remind the kingdom that monarchy was not only power but spectacle. The lute's music, gentle and flowing, was joined by viols and voices. Courtiers in costume danced in intricate patterns, their steps echoing the fragile balance Catherine sought in politics. The allegories told of peace, of unity, of love triumphant over discord. Yet those who watched knew that beyond the walls, armies still gathered, villages still smoldered, blood still stained the earth. Catherine understood this too, but she believed that appearances had power of their own. If men could not be reconciled by faith, perhaps they could be softened by beauty, by the memory of shared wonder beneath torchlight. She spared no expense. Gold was poured into these entertainments, jewels into costumes, imagination into every detail. Some criticized her extravagance, yet Catherine believed the crown's survival required not only strength, but splendor. A kingdom in ruins must still appear whole, else the very image of France would crumble. Thus she gilded her court, wrapped her children in performances where they appeared as gods and heroes, and presented to Europe the illusion of majesty. But illusions, however lovely, cannot silence whispers. Even as lutes played, rumors clung to her. The very spectacles meant to dazzle were said to conceal darker rites. Some claimed her masks were rituals, her allegories spells, her entertainments enchantments meant to bind nobles in thrall. Her black gowns, ever present, lent weight to the suspicion. She walked among revelry like a shadowed priestess, her face pale in the torchlight, her eyes watchful behind her smile. To her admirers, she was a patron of art. To her enemies, an enchantress weaving snares. Catherine did not argue with either image. She let them both exist, for both served her purpose. Let her be seen as patron, and the artists would flock to her. Let her be feared as sorceress, and the nobles might hesitate to cross her. She moved with the same patience she had always known, weaving appearances into armor, illusions into weapons. The lute played on, its melody delicate, yet behind its softness was the will of a queen who endured storms. Charles IX, her son, often sat at these entertainments pale and restless, his cough hidden by music, his guilt masked by spectacle. Catherine kept him close, guiding his eyes toward beauty when his mind returned to blood. Did she hope the illusions might heal him? Or did she simply hope they might hide his weakness from the court? Perhaps both, for she knew that the image of the king was as fragile as glass, and once shattered, it could never be made whole again. Foreign ambassadors reported these festivals with awe. They described the grandeur, the invention, the magnificence of the Valois court, yet in their words lingered also suspicion, for they saw not only beauty but the woman who created it, and their pens painted her as both queen and conjurer. Europe's imagination fastened on her spectacles as evidence of her unnatural power. The music of the lute, heard across marble halls, became in their writings the music of enchantment, the song of the Black Queen. Still, Catherine continued. She believed in the necessity of art, in the power of illusion to hold together what reality tore apart. She knew the kingdom bled, but she refused to let the court appear wounded. If the people saw the crown glitter, if nobles danced together even for a night, perhaps the fractures could be mended or at least concealed until time provided another chance. The lute's melody lingered into the night, soft and fading, until only its echo remained in the high ceilings of the palace. And when it finally ceased, the silence revealed another sound, harsher, more mortal, the cough of a dying king, Charles IX, whose health faltered as his spirit weakened, leaving Catherine to watch once more as fate reached for her son. The music of the lute faded into silence, leaving the air still, until it was broken by another sound, harsher, mortal, the cough of a dying king. Charles IX, once the laughing child who had inherited the crown at 10, now sat hunched in his chamber, his body racked by illness, his spirit burdened by guilt. The blood of St. Bartholomew's Day had not faded from his memory. It haunted him in dreams, in whispers, in visions that came even in waking hours. He confessed to those closest to him that he heard cries in the night, that he smelled blood where none lay, that he saw faces of the slain staring back at him from shadows. His cough stained his sheets with red, and each spasm seemed to tear more from him than breath alone. Catherine watched her son decline with a heart that was both mother and sovereign. She soothed him, sat beside him, whispered reassurances. She urged him to strength, told him he was still king, told him the crown was not yet lost. But she saw the truth in his hollow cheeks, in his trembling hands, in the eyes that flickered between terror and despair, the guilt of the massacre, the strain of war, the fragility of his body, all pressed upon him, leaving him no space to recover. Catherine, who had fought for decades to protect the throne, knew that she was watching another thread of her dynasty unravel. The court felt it too. Whispers passed through corridors, nobles spoke in low tones, foreign ambassadors reported the king's decline. France held its breath, uncertain who would reign when Charles fell. Catherine remained the steady figure, moving between council and sickroom, her black gown trailing softly, her face calm. Yet even she could not turn aside the course of fate. Her son was dying, and with him died another hope for stability. In those final years of his reign, Catherine's authority became both more necessary and more precarious. She negotiated treaties, managed factions, and tried to balance Catholic and Huguenot once more. But each peace collapsed, each truce dissolved, each battlefield scarred the land anew. The The wars of religion seemed endless, their cycle of hatred feeding upon itself. Catherine sought moderation, compromise, survival. Yet in a time when men demanded victory or vengeance, moderation was called weakness, compromise betrayal, survival cunning. Her name darkened further, her image twisted more, as though every failure of France were her doing, every cruelty her command. Still, she endured. She had endured since childhood, through convent walls, through the humiliation of Diane, through the splinter of the lance, through the massacre. Now she endured again, watching her son waste away, her dynasty weaken, her kingdom bleed. In her endurance lay her strength, but endurance did not lessen sorrow. At night, in her own chamber, she must have heard his cough echo through stone walls, a sound that pierced more deeply than any rumor. Charles grew restless, often irrational. He lashed out in anger, then wept in despair. He spoke of bloodhounds sent to him by God, of rivers that carried bodies past his bed. Catherine held him through these fits, her arms steady, though her heart must have broken. She told him he was forgiven, though perhaps she did not believe it herself. She told him he had done what was necessary, though perhaps she wondered in secret whether any act of necessity could excuse so much blood. The nobles circled like hawks, waiting for the end. The Guys watched. The Bourbon waited. Foreign powers prepared. Catherine, as always, stood between them, protecting the fragile crown for her next son, Henry of Anjou, who would return from Poland to inherit. She wrote letters, arranged transitions, prepared the realm for another change of ruler. Yet all the while she remained at Charles's side, holding his hand when fever raged, cooling his brow, whispering prayers. She was accused of poison even then, accused of hastening his end, but the truth was simpler. Consumption and guilt were his killers, and Catherine was left only to bear witness. In May of 1574, Charles IX breathed his last. He was only 23. The cough that had echoed through the palace fell silent, leaving behind a void that no music, no spectacle, no prayer could fill. Catherine wept. For whatever else she was a mother who had lost another child. Yet even in her grief, she did not falter. She rose from his bedside, composed herself, and prepared for the next act. Another son would wear the crown, and she must endure once more. The cough of Charles lingered still in the silence of the palace, an echo that seemed never to fade, as though the walls themselves remembered. And into that silence stepped new sounds, lighter, more deceptive. The flutter of masks at a court ball, heralding the reign of Henry III, Catherine's next son, whose court would dazzle with decadence even as France continued to bleed. The cough of Charles IX lingered in memory, heavy and sorrowful. Yet in the palace it was soon overtaken by a different sound, lighter but no less troubling. The flutter of masks at a court ball. For in 1574, after Charles's death, the crown passed to his brother, Henry, Duke of Anjou, who returned from his brief kingship of Poland to ascend the throne of France as Henry III. He was Catherine's favorite, the son she cherished with a tenderness not always evident in her stern rule. Yet he was also the most enigmatic, the most elusive, a king whose reign would be as much spectacle as sovereignty. The flutter of masks marked his court, for Henry delighted in pageantry, in balls where courtiers appeared in disguise, in masks where roles were exchanged, where identity itself seemed a costume. He surrounded himself with companions of elegance, men who were whispered of with disdain by the nobles, yet whom Henry adored for their wit, their beauty, their devotion. The French called them the mignons, and their presence became the subject of both fascination and scandal. Henry adorned them with jewels, lavished them with favors, paraded them through the streets in finery that rivaled princes. His court became a theater of decadence, where appearances often mattered more than decisions, and where politics were dressed in the silks of masquerade. Catherine watched all this with eyes both fond and weary. She loved Henry, loved him with a depth born of his charm, his quickness, his place in her heart. Yet she also saw his weaknesses, his vanity, his indecision, his retreat into ritual and spectacle. She counseled him, reminded him of the kingdom's fragility, urged him to attend to the divisions that still tore France apart. For the wars of religion had not ended with Charles's cough. They smoldered still. Catholics and Huguenots locked in suspicion, the crown forever at risk. Catherine, tireless, continued her role as mediator, guardian, traveler, across a land still bleeding. Yet Henry was not Charles. He was not racked with guilt, but he was often paralyzed by choice. He loved ceremony, processions, devotions, elaborate rituals of piety mixed with extravagant shows of fashion. He would spend hours in prayer, then hours adorning himself, then hours in revelry. Catherine saw in him both king and boy, sovereign and child, and she sought to steady him as she had steadied his brothers. But Henry, though he listened, often drifted into his own path, a path of masks and indulgence. The flutter of masks at his balls seemed to Catherine more than entertainment. They seemed emblem of the age itself, where faces were veiled, loyalties disguised, truth hidden behind painted smiles. Nobles wore masks of faith, but sought only power. Priests preached certainty, but whispered intrigue. Even Catherine herself wore masks of widow, of mother, of mediator, of black queen. Perhaps she saw in Henry's revelries the mirror of her own existence, where reality was never naked, always clothed in costume. The kingdom, meanwhile, did not rest. The Catholic League, led by the Guise family, grew in strength, demanding harsher measures against the Huguenots. The Bourbons, allied with Protestant cause, resisted fiercely. France seemed ever poised upon the edge of collapse. Catherine, despite her age, traveled ceaselessly, meeting nobles, negotiating edicts, urging truce. She wore her black gowns through cities and fields, her presence commanding, her endurance unbroken. She sought again and again to balance the factions, to preserve the monarchy against the flood of division. Yet each peace was temporary, each truce fragile, each flutter of masks at court, a prelude to fresh blood in the streets. Her relationship with Henry remained close, though strained at times by his whims. She reminded him that kingship was not mask, but burden, not revelry, but responsibility. He listened, but his nature was not to endure as she had endured. Still, he loved her, valued her, leaned upon her counsel when the weight of conflict pressed too heavily. She remained his anchor, the constant figure in his court of shifting masks. Rumors about her did not fade. If anything, they grew. Foreign observers wrote of her influence as sorcery, her endurance as manipulation, her every act as cunning. They whispered that she poisoned those who opposed her, that she cast spells through festivals, that her black attire was not mourning, but ritual. Catherine endured such talk as she always had, unmoved. She knew that reputation was another mask, one she could not remove, so she wore it as shield. If others saw her as dark, so be it. Darkness, too, could command respect. In these years, Catherine also contended with her daughters, whose marriages had spread across Europe, weaving new webs of alliance and discord. Margaret of Valois, wife of Henry of Navarre, rebelled against her marriage, her letters filled with bitterness, her life caught between Catholic and Protestant. Catherine sought to reconcile her, to keep the bonds of family, yet Margaret's defiance brought scandal. Catherine bore it, as she bore all, with a mixture of sorrow and steel. The flutter of masks filled the palace still, yet Catherine's ears also heard the rumble of discontent outside. The League grew bolder, the Bourbons more defiant, the people more restless. She saw that the crown itself was no longer steady upon the Valois head. Yet she pressed on, arranging councils, urging compromise, offering her own body to the road as she traveled to mediate. Her age increased, her health waned, yet her will remained iron. She would not relinquish her role while breath remained. The court balls continued, the music swelled, the masks fluttered. Catherine, seated in her widow's black, watched with steady gaze. She must have known that these revelries could not last, that behind every mask was a blade, behind every smile a threat. The kingdom's fractures deepened, and even her patience could not mend them forever. The flutter of masks lingered in the torchlight, but beyond them Catherine heard another sound, distant yet sharp, the flick of a blade. Drawn in secret, ready to strike in shadows where masquerades could no longer conceal betrayal. The flutter of masks faded, and in the hush that followed came a sharper sound, quick and unmistakable, the flick of a blade. Daggers had long been part of the kingdom's theater, hidden in sleeves, carried in shadows, whispered of in corridors. By the time Henry III had settled into his reign, France was no longer a realm of mere quarrels, but a kingdom where blades were drawn in the name of faith and loyalty alike, and where murder walked as companion to politics. Catherine, now in her late 50s and weary in body though not in will, knew this better than anyone. For she had lived through massacre and rebellion, through the fall of sons and the rise of factions, and she knew that words alone could not still the hand that grasped at a dagger's hilt. Yet Catherine did not retreat into chambers or cloister. She took to the road with unrelenting resolve, her carriages rattling across cobblestones, her horses weary from endless miles. From Paris to Tours, from Lyons to Bordeaux, she traveled, meeting nobles face to face, soothing their rage with promises, warning them of dangers, urging them into truce. She became more than mother of kings. She was a living envoy, a presence whose endurance itself carried weight. Her black gown, familiar to all, became a symbol of continuity. Wherever she arrived, the people saw not only a queen mother, but the embodiment of the monarchy's persistence. The flick of the blade was never far. In cities she passed, plots were whispered, leagues formed, assassins hidden. Yet Catherine moved steadily, guarded by soldiers, supported by her name, trusting as always in patience and persuasion. She sat with the Guys, fierce in their Catholic zeal, and listened. She sat with the Bourbon, determined in their Protestant cause, and listened. She promised what she could, delayed what she must, gave enough to each to keep them bound to crown rather than rebellion. It was not peace, not truly, but it was survival. And survival was Catherine's mastery. Her age did not deter her. Though her health declined, though her body ached from travel, she pressed on. She knew her son Henry was not a ruler of steadiness. He was torn between piety and vanity, between ritual and indulgence, between courage and hesitation. He needed her as anchor, as he had always needed her counsel. Catherine did not falter, for she could not. Without her presence, the crown might collapse entirely, and the dynasty she had fought all her life to preserve might vanish into memory. In these journeys, Catherine's reputation grew paradoxical. To some, she was peacemaker, mother of France, the woman who kept the kingdom from ruin. To others, she was deceiver, manipulator, prolonging war with false promises. To all, she was necessary. None could deny that her presence mattered, even when they cursed her name. The flick of the blade might echo in every council, but as long as Catherine's voice followed it, the blade was often returned to sheath, at least for a time. She traveled even when plague stalked the land, even when armies clashed nearby. Her letters reveal fatigue, sorrow, longing for rest, yet always a refusal to stop. She was driven not only by ambition, but by a sense of destiny. Perhaps she believed she had been chosen to hold the crown aloft, as priestess holds a relic, until the storms passed. Or perhaps she simply could not imagine life without the struggle, for endurance had become her very being. Henry's court glittered with masks still, but Catherine's journeys took her into towns scarred by war, into fields where smoke lingered, into halls where nobles argued with clenched fists. She walked among them not as enchantress, but as mediator, carrying no sword, only the weight of her authority. Sometimes she succeeded, and treaties were signed. Sometimes she failed, and war resumed. Yet always she returned to the road, relentless, unbroken. The flick of the blade haunted her nonetheless. She knew daggers would one day strike where her words could not reach. She had seen too much blood to believe otherwise. Still she pressed forward, for to stop was to yield, and Catherine had never yielded. At night, in the towns where she lodged, she would sit before a candle, the wax dripping steadily, and listen. Perhaps she heard the muffled sounds of guards outside, the murmur of her attendants, the creak of old wood. But beneath it all she would hear the blade, the symbol of her age, the instrument of her time. And she knew it would strike again, for in France daggers were drawn not only by assassins, but by destiny itself. The flick of the blade lingered, sharp and unresolved, until it cut into the silence of the next chapter of her life, the assassination of the Duke of Guise, an act that shattered alliances and sent France deeper into fury, leaving Catherine once more to walk between daggers and crowns. The flick of a blade echoed still, sharper than the flutter of masks, for it was no longer a hidden dagger whispered of in corridors, but a weapon raised openly in the politics of the realm. In 1588, the Duke of Guise, champion of the Catholic League and rival to Henry III, met his fate at Blois. It was the king's order, long delayed, long feared, now carried out with finality. The Duke, tall and proud, walked into the council chamber, believing himself untouchable, believing that his strength over the League gave him power greater than the crown. Yet the king's guards fell upon him, their blades flashing, their daggers striking, until the great Guise lay upon the floor, lifeless, his body pierced, his ambition cut short. The palace walls absorbed the sound, and outside, France shuddered. The Guise family, powerful and vengeful, cried out with fury. The Catholic League, already restless, rose in rage against the crown. Henry III had sought to rid himself of his rival, but in so doing he plunged his throne into deeper peril. And Catherine, who had always counseled patience, who had always sought to balance factions rather than cut them down, found herself faced with a realm unraveling. She was old now, her hair silvered, her body weakened, yet her will remained unbroken. She had spent her life traveling across France, arranging treaties, negotiating truces, seeking to preserve monarchy through compromise. Now she watched as her son chose the dagger, and she knew the path would lead only to greater bloodshed. Yet she did not abandon him. She remained at his side, even as nobles cursed his name, even as preachers declared him murderer, even as Paris turned hostile to his rule. She remained the mother, the regent, the Black Queen, steady as stone even when the earth shook beneath her. The flick of the blade had silenced Guise, but it also silenced hope of reconciliation. The League declared rebellion, Paris rose, and Henry found himself king in name more than in power. Catherine, though weary, continued to mediate, urging her son to act with caution, to seek alliance with Henry of Navarre, the Protestant prince who had once married her daughter. It was a bitter counsel, for to ally with a Huguenot against Catholics seemed treason to many, yet Catherine saw no other path. She had always believed that survival lay not in dogma, but in balance, not in zeal, but in endurance. Even now, in her last years, she clung to that belief. The flick of the blade haunted her. She thought perhaps of all the daggers she had known, the lance that killed Henry II, the daggers of Amboise, the blades of St. Bartholomew's night, the assassins in shadows, the murders disguised as politics. She thought of how France seemed ever ruled not by crowns, but by weapons, not by words, but by blood. And she, who had spent her life weaving fragile threads, had always walked among those blades, shielding her sons, shielding the crown. Now she walked more slowly, leaning upon attendants, her strength diminished, yet her presence still commanding. She had outlived many she loved and many she feared. She had seen her sons crowned and seen them die. She had buried enemies, rivals, children, husbands. She had endured more than most, and still she endured. Yet even endurance cannot last forever. The flick of the blade reminded her of her own mortality, of the nearness of her end. She continued her work, but with each passing year her steps grew heavier, her body more frail. She traveled less, but her letters traveled still, carrying her words across France. She counseled moderation until the last, though few now listened. In December of 1588, when the Duke of Guise's blood stained the floor of Blois, Catherine herself was fading. She was not present when the dagger struck, but the news was brought to her. Some say she sighed, some say she wept, some say she turned her face to the wall in silence. Perhaps she felt triumph, for the Guises had long threatened the crown. Perhaps she felt sorrow, for she had always sought to avoid such ends. Perhaps she felt nothing but weariness, for after so many deaths, what was one more? The flick of the blade at Blois did not end the struggle. It deepened it. The League rose. Henry fled Paris. The kingdom trembled on the edge of ruin. Catherine, too weak to travel, remained in Blois, her body confined, her spirit restless. She counseled her son as best she could, urging alliance, urging caution, urging survival. Yet her time was nearly over. The daggers of France would strike again, but she would not see it. The flick of the blade lingered in the corridors, its echo sharp, its presence unresolved. And in the stillness that followed, Catherine's strength began at last to falter, her body failing even as her will pressed forward. The drip of wax from a guttering candle marked her decline, each drop falling soft but certain as the light of her life dimmed. The flick of the blade faded into silence, but in that silence another sound emerged, softer, slower, more relentless, the drip of wax from a guttering candle. Each drop fell with quiet certainty, marking time as it passed, reminding Catherine de Medici that even endurance has its limit. She was old now, worn thin by years of travel, negotiations, grief, and vigilance. Her body, once steady through endless journeys, grew frail. Her steps slowed, her hands trembled, her eyes, though sharp still, tired more quickly beneath the weight of years. Yet even as her body weakened, her mind and her will remained bound to the crown, as if she believed that as long as she breathed, the monarchy could not wholly collapse. She remained at Blois after the assassination of the Duke of Guise, her strength no longer enough to carry her across France. From her chambers she continued to write letters, to advise her son Henry III, to urge moderation even as the kingdom fell deeper into chaos. The Catholic League, enraged by the murder of their leader, rose in furious rebellion. Paris rejected the king. Priests preached against him. Nobles gathered armies of their own. Henry, indecisive, vacillated between defiance and despair. Catherine, too ill to intervene in person, counseled him still, telling him to seek alliance with Henry of Navarre, the Protestant once married to her daughter. She knew such an alliance would be hated by many, but she saw no other path. Survival had always been her compass, and survival now demanded union with former foes. The candle's flame wavered in her chamber as she dictated her words. She must have known they might go unheeded, that her voice no longer carried the weight it once did. Yet she pressed on, for she could not abandon the task that had defined her life. The monarchy was her legacy, her children its vessels, her own endurance its thread. She had given her youth to patience, her middle years to diplomacy, her widowhood to regency. She had carried France through wars, massacres, treaties, betrayals. Could she now lay down that burden, even as death approached? Her attendants described her as still commanding, even in illness. She received visitors with dignity, spoke with clarity, never yielding to weakness before others. Yet in solitude, when the chamber was quiet save for the drip of wax, she must have felt the approach of her end. She had buried her husband, her rivals, her enemies, even some of her children. She had outlived her reputation, seeing herself painted as poisoner, sorceress, Black Queen. She'd outlived the glory of her dynasty too, for she knew the Valois line was near its end. Henry III had no heir, and when he died, the crown would pass beyond her blood. The candle that had burned so fiercely in her keeping would flicker out, and another house, another dynasty, would rise. What did she think then, as the wax dripped steadily? Did she feel triumph, that she had preserved the monarchy through storms that would have broken lesser rulers? Did she feel sorrow, that all her labor had not secured her family's future? Did she feel peace, or only weariness? The questions linger, unanswered, for Catherine revealed little, even at the end. She had worn masks too long to remove them fully, had lived in shadow too long to step wholly into light. Still, those near her saw signs of humanity behind the iron. She worried for her children, even those estranged. She prayed, whispered devotions, asked for masses. She clung not to illusions of victory, but to the hope that France itself would endure. For though she was called foreigner, Italian, poisoner, she had given her life to the French crown, to its survival above all. The dynasty might fall, but perhaps the kingdom would remain, and in that she might find consolation. The candle burned lower, the wax pooling at its base, the light dimming. Catherine, once the tireless traveler, now lay in bed, her breath shallow, her body failing. She could not rise to mediate, could not mount her carriage, could not walk the corridors where daggers once flashed and lutes once played. Her power, once vast, had shrunk to the space of a single room, a desk of letters, a flickering flame. Yet even in that confinement, her presence carried weight. Courtiers still came, nobles still sought her, her son still listened when he could. For though her body weakened, her legacy of endurance lingered, a force that could not be extinguished until the final breath. The drip of wax continued, soft and steady, as though time itself counted down. And with each drop, Catherine's presence grew fainter, her shadow less commanding, her voice less heard. Yet in her fading, the question remained, does power vanish with the body, or does it linger, woven into the memory of all who lived beneath it? The candle guttered low, its light trembling, its wax almost spent, and beyond its faint glow, the toll of a single bell began to rise, solemn and slow, announcing that the end was near. The drip of wax from the guttering candle slowed, and in its place another sound rose, deep and solemn, the toll of a single bell. It rang through Blois on a cold January morning in 1589, announcing that Catherine de Medici was no more. For nearly 70 years she had walked among daggers and crowns, her life woven into the fabric of France, her endurance the thread that held the monarchy together. Now her body lay still, her breath silenced, her presence gone. The bell tolled not only for her death, but for the end of an age, for with her passing the line she had fought so fiercely to preserve would soon vanish into history. Her final days had been marked by frailty. The once tireless traveler who had crossed the kingdom again and again to mediate wars had become confined to her bed. She whispered counsel to Henry III until the last, urging him to reconcile with Henry of Navarre, urging him to place the survival of France above the demands of faction. She never ceased to think of the crown, even as her body betrayed her. Her attendants described her as lucid to the end, her will intact, though her strength was gone. She asked for prayers, for masses, for the rituals of faith, clinging perhaps to the hope of forgiveness, or perhaps only to the comfort of the familiar. When the bell tolled, the court mourned, though not with the depth once reserved for queens. Catherine had lived long enough to become legend, and legends inspire awe, but rarely love. Nobles bowed their heads, ambassadors wrote their dispatches, and preachers spoke of her as Jezebel or as guardian, depending on their creed. The people whispered stories of poisons, of astrologers, of midnight councils. For some, she was the savior of the monarchy. For others, its corrupter. In truth, she was both less and more. A woman who endured, who chose survival above purity, who carried her children and her kingdom through storms no crown should face. Her body was prepared, her black gowns exchanged for the garments of burial. She had worn mourning for decades, and now mourning clothed her in finality. The bells continued to toll, their sound carrying beyond Blois, across the Loire, into towns and villages where the news spread. Catherine de Medici, the Black Queen of France, was dead. Yet even in death, irony clung to her. For all her labor, all her patience, all her sacrifice, the Valois dynasty ended with her son, Henry III, who himself would be slain later that same year. Catherine had preserved the monarchy through massacre, through rebellion, through war, yet she had not preserved her line. The Bourbons would inherit, Henry of Navarre would rise, and her children's crowns would become relics rather than legacies. She had spent her life weaving the fragile threads of survival, only to see them unravel at the end. Did she know as she closed her eyes that all her work would dissolve so swiftly? Or did she trust that survival itself was victory, that France endured because she endured, even if her dynasty did not? The question lingers, like the toll of the bell, unanswered. Perhaps she believed that endurance was its own justification, that the act of holding chaos at bay, even for a time, was worth the sacrifice of reputation, of peace, of affection. Perhaps she knew that history would curse her, but she chose survival over memory. The bell tolled on, each stroke heavy, carrying through the air like the final punctuation of her life. Those who heard it may have thought of her as mother, as queen, as poisoner, as sorceress, as mediator, as tyrant. She was all of these, and none, for she was a woman who lived not in absolutes, but in shadows, where necessity ruled and certainty dissolved. In Blois, the candle at her bedside had gone out, its wax hardened, its flame extinguished. The bell continued to toll, slow and steady, as though measuring the silence she left behind. The toll of the single bell faded into silence, leaving only the stillness of winter air, and into that silence came another sound, softer, drier, less certain, the rustle of old manuscripts. For after Catherine de Medici's death, it was not only the voices of mourners that spoke of her, but the pens of chroniclers, the quills of pamphleteers, the ink of enemies and admirers alike. In manuscripts, letters, sermons, and tales whispered across taverns and courts, her memory was shaped, darkened, embroidered, until legend and fact were bound together like threads impossible to untangle. The stories came quickly. They spoke of cabinets of poison hidden within the Louvre, of shelves lined with phials and powders that killed without trace. They told of rings with hollow gems whose points concealed deadly venom to be slipped into a cup or pressed against a hand. They whispered that Catherine's astrologers, Cosimo Ruggieri among them, had built a secret chamber in the palace where the stars were charted and incantations muttered. They said she spent her nights in those rooms, reading the heavens for signs, calling upon spirits to foretell her children's reigns. Pamphlets from Protestant lands painted her as a witch, a Jezebel of France who had bathed in the blood of innocents during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. In Catholic pulpits, too, some preachers denounced her as schemer, as foreign interloper, as woman who placed survival above faith. To others, she was the very embodiment of Italian cunning, a Medici whose heart was ruled not by piety, but by power. And in every corner of Europe, her name was spoken with both fascination and dread. Yet within the rustle of manuscripts lies another truth, that rumor itself was the weapon of her enemies. In an age when women rarely ruled openly, when mothers were expected to yield to sons and wives to husbands, Catherine's authority seemed unnatural. To explain it, to diminish it, men clothed her in shadow, painting her not as patient mediator, but as sorceress, not as weary mother, but as poisoner. The rustle of manuscripts became the hiss of accusation, shaping her image for centuries to come. Still, one cannot deny that Catherine courted mystery, if not by intent, then by habit. She never abandoned her mourning black, a gown that turned her into a shadow among glittering courtiers. She did keep astrologers, did consult their charts, did value their predictions. She did study remedies and potions, not only to heal, but perhaps to understand power hidden in nature. Whether she used such knowledge for harm, we cannot know. But rumor thrives on ambiguity, and Catherine gave the world ample ambiguity to weave into legend. In the years after her death, as the Bourbons rose and the Valois faded, her memory became more ghost than woman. In libraries, scribes wrote of her as the Black Queen. In taverns, storytellers spoke of her perfumes that killed and her festivals that bewitched. In paintings and engravings, she was shown severe, stern, her features sharpened by suspicion. The woman who had endured, who had traveled across France to preserve her children's crowns, who had signed edicts and brokered peace, was forgotten. In her place rose a figure half human, half myth, a queen of shadows whose very breath was said to carry poison. And yet, among the rustle of manuscripts, there are voices less harsh. Some chroniclers noted her patience, her tireless labor, her refusal to abandon the monarchy even when all seemed lost. They recorded her travels, her counsels, her endless negotiations. They wrote that, without her, France might have collapsed entirely into fragments of noble rule. To these voices, Catherine was no witch, but a mother who sacrificed her peace for the survival of the crown, who chose endurance over despair. So her legacy remained contested, divided as her kingdom had been. Was she savior or destroyer? Was she protector of her children or manipulator of their fates? Was she ruler by necessity or by cruelty? The manuscripts rustled on, each page carrying its own answer, none silencing the others. Perhaps Catherine herself would have smiled at this, for she had lived her life not in certainties, but in shadows. To be remembered with ambiguity may have been her fate, and perhaps even her triumph, for certainty can be dismissed, but mystery endures. The rustle of old manuscripts continues still, their pages turned by historians, their words debated by readers, their stories retold by storytellers. Catherine lives on in them, not as she was, but as she was imagined, as she was feared, as she was revered. And in that rustle we hear the persistence of her presence, the way her shadow stretches beyond her death, beyond her dynasty, into the centuries that follow. The manuscripts rustle on, yet beyond their dry sound comes another stillness, deeper than rumor, quieter than ink, the silence of rest, of final reflection. For the time has come to look not at her legend but at her essence, to ask whether Catherine was truly the Black Queen or whether she was only the mirror of her age, reflecting its cruelty, its fear, its endless hunger for survival. The silence waits for an answer, though none may come. The rustle of old manuscripts softened, and at last gave way to silence, a silence deeper than rumor, broader than memory, a silence in which Catherine de Medici herself seemed to rest. It is in that silence that we must turn to reflection, for the question lingers still. Was she truly the Black Queen, or was she merely the mirror of her age, reflecting its cruelties, its faiths divided, its desperate grasp for survival? In her lifetime, she was called poisoner, sorceress, Jezebel, Italian usurper, manipulator of her sons, orchestrator of massacre. And yet she was also mother, mediator, traveler, guardian of a fragile monarchy that might otherwise have shattered long before the Bourbons came to claim it. To reduce her to villain or saint is to flatten the shadows into which she was born and in which she lived. Catherine endured, and endurance was her defining act. In convent walls, in foreign courts, in the shadow of a mistress, in the tumult of wars, in the guilt of her sons, she endured. Perhaps it was endurance, rather than ambition or cruelty, that gave her the air of mystery. She did not break when others would have broken. She wore black not as a symbol of sorcery, but as widowhood. Yet in wearing it so long, she became a shadow herself. She sought guidance from astrologers not because she believed she could command fate, but because she feared it, because she wished for any sign to guide her through storms. She was accused of poison because enemies could not understand how a woman could hold power without darker means. Yet she held it, again and again, not through sorcery, but through patience, calculation, and an unyielding will to preserve her children's crowns. Still, the darkness remains. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre cannot be spoken of without her name. Whether she commanded it or merely allowed it, whether she orchestrated or simply failed to stop it, the blood of Paris stains her memory. It is a stain that cannot be washed away, a shadow that follows her into every judgment. Yet even there the question persists. Was she acting in cold calculation or in fear or in desperation? Perhaps she herself did not know. History often seeks certainty where none exists. But Catherine's life was lived in ambiguity, and ambiguity resists judgment. As we look upon her now, centuries later, we see both guardian and destroyer, protector and schemer, mother and queen. Her legacy is double as the world in which she lived, where faith divided brother from brother, where loyalty shifted with wind, where survival demanded choices that could never be pure. Catherine was neither angel nor demon. She was human, and in her humanity lay both cruelty and care, both shadow and endurance. What remains of her now are not only the manuscripts and rumors, but the traces of her hand upon France, the gardens she built, the festivals she staged, the art she patronized, all left beauty amid blood. The children she bore, though their dynasty ended, carried her line into crowns beyond France, and her very endurance, her refusal to let the monarchy collapse, paved the way for the Bourbon kings who followed. In this sense, she succeeded. Yet in another, she failed, for she did not save her dynasty, and she did not cleanse her name. Perhaps that is the truth of power. It never yields pure triumph, only fragments of victory bound with threads of loss. Catherine knew this. She lived it. She carried it with every breath. And now she rests in silence, her story left for us to ponder, her shadow left for us to wander through. The silence deepens, and with it comes a question, gentle as the night. When we remember those who ruled in shadows, should we condemn them for the darkness? Or should we see in them the reflection of our own age, our own fears, our own choices. Catherine's life offers no clear answer. It offers only the reminder that history is never simple, that truth is always bound to perspective, that the past is both mirror and mystery. And so we leave her there, the Black Queen of France, standing in her black gown at the edge of memory, her eyes steady, her presence enduring. She fades into the silence, and in that silence the listener may find rest, not in certainty, but in the gentle hum of unanswered questions. The silence lingers. The candle is extinguished. The story is done.